facilities, and then June, we're doing some case studies around the
I think I saw that.
Yeah, I was, yeah. Wait, let me do my math. Yeah, the first one or?
Welcome, everyone. We'll give people a minute or two to get settled. There are some inserts for your binders in the back, as well as some new and improved snacks, as well as the good old snacks too. So please help yourself.
Those of you that sound like from work.
I had to go home for a little bit second because we just got new doors at our house. And I had locked my son out so we could get in. Cool. It was like 4 o'clock. What are you doing in your with all the free time you must have this week?
A lot of hanging out. Take care of my husband.
Because that specific private school is located 5 miles.
Point of friend.
That's all good stuff.
That's my retirement.
Terrific.
There's things we can do.
How are things with you?
All right.
Yeah.
We have, I don't know, if you ever met or saw our children. They used to be very young, and now one is a freshman, my daughter's a freshman in college, and our son will be graduating in 6 weeks from high school. So we have to, somewhere is gonna get a deposit from us in about 3 weeks. We don't know yet where.
Oh, really?
I was visiting.
Okay, so just so we stay on time, we'll go ahead and get started and at least do some introductions. I know there are some of you who are coming in person for the first time, so happy to have everybody here. Hopefully you're all familiar with me. I'm Nate Morris with Perkins Eastman.
I'm Lauren Sperling, also with Perkins Eastman.
And then give some of the rest of our team in the back a chance to speak. So Charles, if you want to introduce yourself. Yeah, and so we're working with Prism on the project on the engagement piece. Yeah, thank you, Charles. And then
I'm Michelle Lensky, I'm the manager of design and construction for facilities maintenance.
Kevin Raymer, planning analyst for the North and Central regions.
Linda Richardson, planning analyst for the Southwest and East regions.
awesome. And then we also have a few folks in the room just to provide some MPS expertise on the subjects of focus tonight, the topics of focus, excuse me. So we want to give those folks a chance to introduce themselves. And
Sure. Ryan Albert, transportation supervisor.
And then, yes, in the back.
John Hill, director of college for readiness.
Alicia Sackel, senior director of curriculum instruction.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, so really happy to have you all here. And as we get to sort of the breakout work, we'll have them sort of floating around to provide context and information on the topics at hand. So as we've done in the past, we want to move really quickly through the presentation piece to try to maximize the amount of time that you all have to work collectively together. We'll run through everything as quickly as possible. Obviously, if there are questions or clarifications, we want to make sure that we're providing that insight as well. So we'll just go ahead and get started. With the administrative items, there are some extra materials in the back there. So just keeping in mind that those are on the Google Drive as well. Everything that we are printing out to hand to you, you should have access to that. If you're having any issues with access, I know some of the stuff this month got moved around a little bit. So if a link didn't work the first time, give it another try, and then please don't hesitate to email, call, whatever. It's important to us that we, are providing you with the information. So feel free to let us know, and then I'll let Lauren sort of speak to what we've heard from the Community Insights Forum thus far.
Yeah, so across the entire Community Insight Forum for all the regions, we've only gotten a couple different feedbacks, but focused on last meeting with enrollment and kind of the lack of transparency or access to that information for parents and other community members to know what programs are offered at the schools. And then also kind of around not just the marketing of those programs, but a focus on having schools uphold the things that they are marketing out to the community. Looking at some improvements for neighborhood schools and a couple different options. And then a couple focuses on the challenges that neighborhood schools kind of instill and how to create equity across the different regions.
So we'll make sure that this, and I know we wanted to be as comprehensive as possible, but there is one of these for each of the regional presentations as well. So just to speak to the Google Drive, you have access to each region. So even if you are specific to Citywide or specific to East Region, you can go into any region, look at their presentation, see that specific information as well. And we want to make sure that we're sharing everything with you. So if there's ever anything that you feel like we've spoken about, but that isn't easily accessible, please let us know, so that we can make sure. There are probably other folks with the same question. So before we move on, actually, just wanted to speak to one other thing that had come up, Michelle.
Yeah. So I just wanted to address a question that came up from actually one of the committee members here, and I think it was a really valid question and point. So it's a question about, hey, there's all these environmental things that we're dealing with the lead paint and all that. And then in addition to that, with our leadership change. And so I just want to address kind of on a high level, you know, how we kind of view this. Leadership change happens. And so one of the things that I have been saying, and I think our team has heard me say this, because I've been with the district like since 1985, okay? So I've been to a lot of different leaders. This plan cannot be one leader's plan. This plan is not the facilities and maintenance long-range facilities plan. This plan belongs to the district. And this is actually why we have all of you here, because in the past, we have never quite reached out the way we have here. My goal and our intent with all of this is that we have the momentum, and we have others than just, you know, a small team bringing this forward. So that is a key thing for I think the organization and the way we're doing this one, which is very different from any we have done in the past. So I think leadership wise, it cannot change. I mean, we need to plow through changes in board members, changes in leadership, changes in directors, because it's going to happen. But the key thing is this is a living plan that's updated. So this is why we're so grateful for everybody's time and effort into this. The second issue was, you know, the lead issue that we're dealing with, and it's a big one, and it's going to become a huge component when we start looking at those facility conditioning factors and some of those others. So we're discussing how might the criteria change. So that is one of the things as we start looking into the facilities, which is next month, which is very timely. We'll have a really much better handle on some of the plans going forward. So I think we're going to be in a really good place to kind of discuss that and how it might play in and you know, impact some of the facilities discussions. But you know, it's an issue, and it's quite frankly, it points out the age of our facilities and some of the challenges that we're dealing with. So it's a challenge, but you know, it just makes this work even that much more important. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think next month we'll able to share a lot more in the coming months as we start getting into more of building the plan, right? Adding some more fine details. I think we'll have a lot of really good information. So hopefully that answers some questions if there were any out there. But all right, and thank you again for your support.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, echoing all of that, you know, with next month's meeting, focusing on facilities, really looking into those sort of built environment components, and also giving a preview of the following month, just to kind of lay things out for y'all and help you understand how we're thinking about it. But our thinking as of now for the June meeting will be to really focus on, you know, we've done a lot of sort of knowledge-based pieces here with these three big components that we've had for this meeting, the last meeting, and the next meeting. And then sort of having that June meeting focus on what are other school districts doing that are facing similar challenges, right? Like if they're, you know, as we've mentioned kind of throughout, MPS is not alone in a lot of the challenges that it's facing. So how are other districts in the state of Wisconsin, nationally, sort of approaching these, what are the strategies they're sort of implementing, and what have the outcomes been? So as we start to look into all that, we want to, you know, have that be an opportunity to really start to get the wheels turning on everything we've just learned, how that's being put into practice, and then looking to Milwaukee to see, you know, what's the right application here and what are those right strategies? And then also, how do we make sure that we're getting out, you know, into the community to start to say, like, here are some potential, you know, considerations, like how does this land? Because I think right now, a lot of the engagement work, it's tough because it all feels very hypothetical and theoretical about like what do you like about your school, or what's making you decide this. But I think once people start to see, you know, things that feel a little more tangible and concrete, it's a little easier to have that conversation. So that is not to say we shouldn't be reaching out to other folks now, but just wanting to plant those seeds. So hopefully this is not the first time you're seeing this, but if so, that's fine. We'll move quickly through it and just kind of touch on transportation and programs, landscape analysis. Starting at the national level, just noting that, you know, just over half of all K-12 students in the US are transported at public expense. So that is a qualifier that it's not all school buses, but it is publicly funded, and that average cost per rider is about $1,150. When this chart over here is showing pre-pandemic costs, so that is worth pointing out. But just to give you an idea of the range that does exist, and I think that trend of having a range has continued in the state of Wisconsin. Averages about $560 per rider. So that factors in all the districts. You'll see on the next slide that Milwaukee is closer to the 1,100 mark, so that national average. I'm just given some of the, you know, unique considerations for the student population that is being transported here, with a higher sped population, higher population of students who are lower socioeconomic status or maybe experiencing homelessness. And then, you know, some of that wider range here, Patrick had spoke to this last week, but DC, for example, is at the highest mark. I think they are at like $1,500 per student, and that is because they're only actually providing transportation for special education students. They are not providing transportation otherwise. So that is why smaller buses, higher, you know, sort of needs for those students, and more complicated transportation. So looking at the Milwaukee part, like I mentioned, the average cost is around $1,100, about 51,000 students being transported. That is including private school students. So that is not all MPS students. And then it looks like for the budget this year is just around 65 million, which makes up just over 4% of the overall MPS budget. So it is a relatively small portion, but significant nonetheless.
What's the difference between the number and the first bullet and the second? I was kind of trouble.
Yes, good question. So the first bullet shows that about, I think, 36,000 of the 67,000 roughly MPS students who are using transportation. The second bullet factors in private school students, so other K-12 students in Milwaukee who are eligible for transportation but aren't MPS. Going on from there, just to kind of look at the history of transportation, some of the challenges that have existed. A lot of you have probably heard about driver shortages. They were certainly very prevalent in the pandemic, you know, when everything kind of halted, bus drivers were not needed, and then trying to bring them back all of a sudden when schools are reopening created a lot of challenges. And just some of the sort of ongoing challenges that exist at that national level, stagnating or even dropping weekly wages for school bus drivers compared to the average workers. And even, you know, lower increase in hourly wage change as well. This bottom graph is from Hop Skip Drive, which is a rideshare organization that does a fair amount of research as well around transportation, school transportation specifically, and they do a large survey every year nationally. So the link is there in the corner. It's a lot of really interesting data just on the impacts of transportation with public schools, if you're interested. So all of that should be clickable through the PDF that's shared there. So moving into these Milwaukee focus of school bus driver shortages. So I think it's important to just point out that yes, post-pandemic definitely was a large issue. Many of you probably experienced that, or at the very least heard about it. But you know, students you know, not getting picked up or dropped off on time, transportation being generally less reliable. You know, that driver shortage showing up in a lot of different ways, and the impact that transportation can have on chronic absenteeism. But it is worth noting that I would say, if I'm not speaking too boldly, a corner has been turned on the driver shortages, at least with Milwaukee specifically. I think statewide, I believe it is still an issue, and nationally it is as well. Ryan, I don't know if you want to speak to that or keep me honest, even.
Yeah, I would say that we're comfortable with where our driver pool is now. It's, first year back from the pandemic, it was about 500 drivers, which we had 1,100 in a two-tier system before. We're about at 700 drivers, which is a comfortable number to be at.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that. And some of the pieces that we'll get to in a second, but switching to, so before getting to this, I guess, switching to a three-tiered system, a lot of school districts are finding, creative solutions and different ways to approach school transportation to try to deal with the shortages or lower amount of drivers that are there now. Another interesting trend that I think is worth pointing out that we think, since COVID-19, just the rise in private vehicle use for student drop-off and the sort of decline in school bus ridership. So depending on the age, you may also see a tick up in bike or foot transportation, and really just seeing how that's changing and how it's impacting school operations, really. A lot of schools weren't designed to have a very long line of cars around the block ready for drop-off, and they're just, there's challenges from idling cars and the pollution that comes along with that. So it is sort of creating a host of new issues for schools to deal with. But when you dig in a little further, and you'll see that there's actually pretty stark differences between how that is shaking out in terms of what students and families are increasing their private vehicle use. So on the left is families who have a parent with a 4-year bachelor degree. On the right is families without that. So you'll see that school bus ridership is up in the families without the 4-year degree, and then it is significantly lower on the other side. So just as we talk about transportation, keeping in mind the equity component that comes along with that and making sure that that is part of the conversation as well. I know I'm moving quickly here. So just some updates, as I mentioned, Colorado Springs is one district that's interestingly sort of using AI to help them with optimizing their bus routes. So they actually are dealing with a large shortage as well, but switching their structure and the routes that they were using to run, they actually have seen significant or report seeing significant savings there. One that might be more interesting, a little closer to home, is CPS using, I believe it was a parent-started network called the Piggyback Network, which is basically a carpooling application. And so it allows parents and families to sort of highlight the routes that they're going to school and, rely on one another to help get their kids there. And given that CPS is another district where there is a good amount of choice, it's interesting to see how that is applied. This should also be, if you click on any of the images, it should bring you straight to the article in the PDF. So, yeah.
I have a question back on the transportation statistics.
Yeah.
So why are we required to pay transportation for private schools?
Can I call on?
Yeah. And so there's a state statute 121, which essentially states that we have to provide reasonable uniformity in the way that we facilitate transportation for the students in our district compared to the private schools, not only in the city of Milwaukee, but within a 5-mile radius of the city of Milwaukee. So we have to, we enroll those students in Infinite Campus and we apply transportation services. Typically, we apply it in what's either a parent contract, a direct payment to families to set up transportation, or a contract directly with the school.
Is it the full fee? The MPS pays the full fee?
It's the average cost to transport an MPS student during a school year. So there's the state statute 121, and there's also the administrative policy with Milwaukee Public Schools.
This is a national thing. I've seen this in other school districts.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really worth pointing out. And a lot of other school districts are also providing transportation to independent charter school students, which my memory serves me is not the case here. Is that correct?
There are, so charter schools not affiliated with Milwaukee Public Schools. We may, under those same laws, we may facilitate transportation. We may provide the parent contract that goes directly to the parent or the primary. Based on how the laws work out and the eligibility of the students.
Got it. But yeah, certainly.
So I can understand this, if it's a private school here, let's just say in the city, MPS oversees transportation if that's needed to that school for the students. Does the students' parents or something pay then to does anyone put that money back into our pot of money, or do we get extra money per every student that we're transporting?
No, so generally speaking, there's very few schools that we actually set up yellow bus services. Most of the repayment occurs directly to families or directly to the private school. So how the law is written is that the private schools have to give us their enrollment information before July 1st. And based on that enrollment information before July 1st, and based on the eligibility of the students and how we apply reasonable uniformity, we have to essentially send checks either directly to the private schools or directly to the parents, depending on what contract that private school signs. Now, these laws, a lot of these private school reimbursement laws specifically in Wisconsin were created before mass choice existed.
Do we, still don't understand the answer though, I mean, do we get money back per every student? So we're just out that money, so anyone that goes to a private school that needs transportation,
Correct.
NPS just they never get reimbursed for that.
Yeah, I don't know the exact dollar amount. I know it's in the millions, so it's I believe it's over $2 million annually.
I mean, to be fair though, in our previous discussion on funding, kids who are enrolled in choice schools, NPS does still get a stipend for those kids, even though we're not educating those kids. So
No,
it's a little more complicated than that.
only the charter ones.
No, for choice as well, right? There's a percentage formula, right? We get a percentage, the choice school gets a percentage.
No,
No.
no.
Per student.
Okay. Yeah, happy to confirm that too with Nick if we want, but yeah, and just to make sure we save time, and happy to, obviously as we get into the breakout conversations, keep these going, but just to get through these. So digging into some updates that have happened locally with NPS specifically. So you all may be aware of the shift in start times for that 3-tier system, just to allow, it sounds like students were arriving late. So, again, going back to the chronic absenteeism piece and the impact that transportation can have from that perspective. So knowing that can also be a challenge for families. I know that a lot of the committees, both this time and last month, were talking about just the impact that a school start time might have on school selection. And then the second piece would just be the bus tracking app that was opened up. So going back to that reliability and knowing, where your kid is in terms of when they're coming home and stuff. So it just provides more visibility and transparency for families in terms of having that information at hand. Transitioning a little bit into specialty schools. So super quick history lesson just about, after desegregation came into play in the 70s, when the courts required many districts, including MPS, to desegregate their schools. Busing was a huge part of that. So schools, as well as specialty programs. So a lot of districts, MPS included, stood up these magnet programs or specialty school programs. And then sort of along with that came a lot of busing that allowed districts to integrate more effectively in theory. As we've seen both nationally and in MPS, segregation is still really prevalent. So there are certainly stories of the positive impacts that it's had, but overall, from a data standpoint, you're still seeing a lot of that happening both here and nationwide. So just digging in a bit to some of the specialty programs that MPS is most known for, and the perspective, just to give context on that. Public Montessori program, so knowing that MPS has the most public Montessori schools out of any district in the US, and just seeing over the last several decades the growth that has happened. So sort of slowly creeping up, this graph stops at 2014, but it sounds like from the data we could find, it looks like it's still around 500 public Montessori schools that are existing. So it has crept up a little. And then but that only accounts for 10% of all the Montessori schools in the US. So not necessarily all of them are public, but certainly a fast growing number. Not as quickly growing as the language programs, however, which have increased by like 250% over the last 10 years, or a 10-year span in recent history. You're seeing that 80% of these are Spanish speaking. So really seeing a strong uptick there. And like we talked about last month with the rise in English language learners that is happening pretty consistently nationwide, would expect some of these numbers to continue to grow. And knowing that has been a growing program in the district as well. looking at IB, 45 of 50 states have grown their IB presence over the last 10 years, or a 10-year period here. And that is something that is also reflected locally in the district, knowing that those programs are increasing as well. And then globally, I think it's ticked up by almost a third. So IB programs are expanding. And last but not least, just touching on CTE. So, you know, as sort of conversation shifts away from college being the only path, I know that CTE has been on the rise. Budgets are going up across most states. Looks like, I think we had by around 180 million over the last 10 years on average. And then 85% of students who have participated. So there is a difference between a participant in CTE and a concentrator, somebody who's really on that track. And this is just to give some context on how Milwaukee compares to the state of Wisconsin in terms of where the interest lies, but this isn't showing growth specifically. So happy to touch back on any of that if we'd like to, but last, just want to sort of highlight the decrease in neighborhood schools or assigned schools that is happening nationwide. So what you're seeing here is this first table that shows the decline, sorry. The decline in public schools that are assigned to you, so going to your assigned school, and then you can see here the rise in chosen public schools, so going to those choice schools even in a public school district, which is very prevalent in Milwaukee. So this stops in 2016, but you will see that sort of numbers continue even as private school and homeschool stay pretty steady over that time. So obviously pandemic has increased and changed a lot of those, but this trend does predate sort of what we were seeing then. All right. So I want to quickly move into some of the district versus region points here and make sure that we give you some data here. There's a lot, as I mentioned, for each region. If you want to feel through those, hopefully the Google folder structure is relatively intuitive, but if you ever can't find anything, do let us know. So we've seen this chart before, but just highlighting how few students are going to their sort of neighborhood school. And we have, over the last several meetings, gotten a lot of good suggestions for how to disaggregate this data further and see, you know, how this is happening by grade level, or by program, school program type and things like that. So really wanting to try to, you know, slice this up in a few different ways to understand what we're seeing here. This is one chart that has been on our website, but we think it's really important to highlight is just the travel that is happening within the district and where students are going. So this sort of center line going diagonal is showing how many students are going to school in the same school board district that they live in. So you'll see that, you know, in 2, 3, and 4, so this sort of central area here, it is a pretty low amount, so hovering between 20 and 35%, whereas when you have, look at 6, 7, and 8, very few of them, you know, those numbers are all over 50%, so a majority of students are staying, and very few, mostly single digits, are traveling north to those regions above. So we did also split this out regionally, just to see, you know, with these lines that are more applicable to these meetings and seeing that, you know, for comparison's sake, like the Southwest district, so you can see this, the horizontal axis is where the students live, vertical axis is where they attend school. So 42% of the students who live in the central region are going to school there, whereas the Southwest is 77%. So a lot fewer students who are leaving that region. And even when you look at sort of the central and northwest, only 6% of the students in the Southwest are going there. So just really starting to highlight where that, you know, sort of inter-district travel is happening and in what ways. So travel distance, you'll see this is pretty typical to see as students get older, they tend to travel farther for schools. So you'll see that the sort of spikes in the high school ages, excuse me. And then as we break that down by region, we wanted to try to include all these. It might be a little overwhelming to try to look at all the colored bars here, but you'll see that the East region is actually, so this is where students are traveling to go to school. And the students who are in school in the East region are traveling the farthest on average to get to school. That's actually consistent across all grade levels, which, you know, sorry, the map's gone, that map over there wasn't. But the East region is uniquely shaped. I think it's worth pointing that out too, that it does have an interesting run. So just taking all that into consideration, but you do see longer travel for central region students as well. And just noting that Southwest is pretty much on the lower end for most of those. And then as we break it out just by your average travel distance, by sort of ranges. So these are, again, where students are traveling to go to school. And you'll see that, you know, the East region, they are traveling on average, like the most amount of students who are traveling more than 6 miles to get to school are going to the East region. And you can kind of break that out each way. So I know I'm speaking quickly. I do want to make sure we're maximizing time, but happy to jump back to any of these if we can. And we will have this for you all tomorrow morning, not sooner, but all the other regional ones should be in the Google Drive. And this is just showing again that sort of wide array of grade level configurations, which as students matriculate can cause some challenges for a school not starting at the same grade they finished at, or even just being able to help with, you know, sort of projections in terms of where students might go and standardizing support. So digging into programs a little bit, you know, we see that around 65% of schools have a specialty programming that falls in these categories. It does not necessarily make them a quote unquote specialty school altogether. There's whole school programming versus like a featured specialty program. AP being a good example, like a school is not an advanced placement school is not a thing. It's a program that exists within a high school, whereas a Montessori school is a whole school model. So just pointing out the distinctions there. And this is an interesting chart that is too small to read from where you were sitting, but this is in every presentation for the regional districts we just highlighted. It really starts to show you kind of a breakdown of where those programs exist across the district by region. So you'll see, for example, the Southwest has 86% of the bilingual programs are in that region, where you have a couple without, the East region having a much smaller amount. Also pointing out that, you know, Southwest is in the lead on a few of them. So Project Lead the Way, IB programs as well. Sorry, it's hard to see them all, but yeah, would very much invite you all to dig into this and just kind of see how that spread is. And as we get into the breakout conversations, wanting to think about how that sort of geographic dispersion of programs impacts everything else, and kind of going back to, you know, the conversations around school selection and where families are going and living. Yeah.
Is there any kind of evaluative tool that determines if one of those those schools are actually following through with that identification of those specialty programs?
So I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but in terms of evaluating which specialty programs are where, I think it's worth pointing out a couple things that have come up. So like Gifted and Talented, for example, is showing 50-50. There are 2 schools that had originally qualified when we sort of sorted through this data, but Dr. Hill, I don't know if you want to, or
Sure.
speak to.
So those 2 schools, more of a historical, they're in their names, but we are moving to more of a service model for gifted and talented, because there are gifted and talented students in every school. And so similar to, you may have heard, response to intervention or multi-level system of support, just like the expectation is schools provide supports for students that are struggling. We expect schools to provide supports for students who are accelerating. So that is more of a service. International Baccalaureate, there is an evaluation that the IB organization does do. I think it's every 5 years. Project Lead the Way, we do look at that as well. Same with career and technical education. There are requirements because that is federally funded. So if you have career CTE pathways, there's an expectation of a beginning course and then a more advanced course in that pathway. Advisory board, career and technical education, student organization, internships or work-based learning, sometimes a dual credit option. So for some of the programs, there are more formal evaluations. For others, we're looking at the success rate of students, say for advanced placement courses. So we're going to look more individually at AP biology at school A, B, and C, and we're going to see how the students are doing grade-wise and on their AP exams, that type of thing. So
It is gonna vary. Some of these things that are listed, are more, are sometimes required by law. So bilingual, ESL, depending on the student population. And I don't know, Montessori, they seem to be pretty, they follow, what's that called, the Montessori?
Wait.
The Montessori. There's a group, right, there's that Montessori.
American Montessori's.
Yeah.
There's
So depending on the program, there'll be different types of evaluations, but we are always looking at these things and, we want to make sure that, you know, somebody's saying they're doing something that they actually are doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll jump to the last slide here and then we'll move into sort of the breakout conversations, but this is another one that kind of sort of gives you a sample of what we'll focus on more in the next meeting as well, but a little bit of a trickier graph to read. Basically what you're seeing here is the x-axis, the horizontal axis across the bottom is the travel distance on average to a school, and then the vertical axis is the utilization. So that's enrollment over capacity. And what you're seeing is the schools that are closer to the upper right here are schools that are where students are traveling farther to get to school, and those schools are, you know, more well utilized. So IB is up in that corner where, you know, on average, these students are traveling more than 4 miles to get to school. And those schools are, you know, from an enrollment perspective, seem to be doing well. Whereas some of the schools, you know, on this end where like you have community schools, students aren't traveling as far, but the utilization is lower. And then the size of the circle there is just how many schools that's representing. And the blue circles are whole school programs and the orange circles are. So it takes a little bit to.
Is this just busing or is this like all forms of transportation?
This is all forms of
Okay.
transportation. Yeah, it's a good question. As are the other graphs that we were
Yeah.
showing where we talked about average transportation. So that is not just students who are taking MPS transportation. Good point of clarification. So any questions before we move on? All right. Great. So quickly, we'll just have Laren spin through some of the regional takeaways, just highlighting the idea is not necessarily to pepper you with all the information that's already been discussed to say don't talk about that, is more so to give you the perspective and context. Yeah, go ahead.
How are school board districts and then the regions made? Is it based on student population, adult population, number of schools?
So I can speak briefly to like, not necessarily how they were made, but school board districts are representing, you know, my understanding is it's representing that geographic area. So those are the 8 school board members, and then the at-large, the geographic regions are how MPS is set up, academic support. There's actually a 5th region, which would be high school, but we folded in high school just for the consistency of those lines that had already been drawn and that sort of existed already. I would invite anyone who knows more on it to chime in. Yeah,
Super
please.
quick, so the board districts, kind of like state legislative districts or aldermanic districts are like after a census, they have to be apportioned so that there's equal, and other people will maybe not, if I'm saying this right, there have to be equal numbers of people living in each of those districts geographically. So different from like the district deciding this is how we're gonna cluster and administer schools. Those board districts, they have to have the same population in all 8 districts. And then you have to carve it up in a way to get that.
And the regions are just arbitrary or like roughly similar population, student population?
So I don't know if anybody was here when the regions were done, and I'm not sure I was really involved, but I would say there's some, it appears, you know, just based on, you know, anecdotally, that there are some similarities between some of the schools in those areas and geographically. We were using them at one time for transportation, I believe. So they were kind of set up for that. And then now we do have a regional superintendent, so they kind of monitor, you know, principals of those regions, report to that regional superintendent. So we will notice there are similarities between the schools that are within that region, you know, based on either the neighborhood or the context of, you know, where the school is.
Thank you, I'm sorry, now I know.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And these are very high level takeaways from each of the regions. We welcome you to talk to people from that region in your breakout groups if there are certain details that they really want to highlight, or if you want to dive into these a little bit further, but just as a reference point. The East region was kind of focused around the idea of the fact that parents are willing to send their students further distance around the perceived and real safety concerns within different areas. And then choice comes directly correlated with your access to the information. So if you know of a certain school that you want to send your kid to and have the possibility of sending them there, you will, regardless of the distance of transportation. And then you can't really talk about transportation without talking about the programs within schools and specialty programs, but making sure if we are looking to disperse the amount of students being traveled to different specialty schools, that those schools are upholding the programs that those students are willing to travel for. And then also just layering the complexity of the transportation system with busing in a choice environment, and how that creates more difficulty for tiering systems and just overall budget for moving students who are traveling across Milwaukee. And then focusing in on the distribution of specialty programs as a whole. And then if you want to go Southwest, reliability of transportation was a focus, specialized programs again for the Southwest region, additional security if public transport was to be integrated instead of just yellow bus systems, and then the implications of moving specialty programs into other regions to allow access. In Northwest, the lack of specialty programs and magnet schools was a highlight, focusing in on leadership to kind of instill those programs in their schools and what that looks like from a funding standpoint to retain students in their region, fluctuating enrollment, and how if you don't have the students funding, you can't have people wanting to be transported to your school, and the uneven access across the different regions, and also strengthening safe passage, not only in transit systems, but within walking models as well. And then the central region was the guaranteed standard of transportation, and how parents would select schools that they know they're going to get a bus rather than having to send their kids for a mile walk or onto public transportation. And then the participation of after-school programs and extracurriculars that are limited by the yellow bus system. And then expanding programs to all regions so that students have more choice within that. And then also kind of focused in on what a good neighborhood school would look like to reduce the high transportation, and exit surveys to kind of see why people are leaving those schools, to kind of be able to better retain and also reduce transportation from that.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, so this is meant to be just kind of kindling for conversation. So feel free to use it as starting points. And if there are folks from those regions who feel like we left something out, I mean, we're pulling these together quickly after those meetings happen. So we just want to touch on major points, but want to expand more obviously on those discussions when we do the notes. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I understand these takeaways. So the smaller groups met, they had group discussions. This feedback, is that based on individual personal perception or experience? Or was it based on data that came from other sources, like a survey of parents? So that, to me, that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and without being able to speak, comprehensively with a binary yes or no on that, I think it depends on which point of detail, like which point you're talking about. Generally, I would say it's more people talking on their experience, what they're working on, and less focused on specific data points. But I would say any of those that come up where you're like, not sure, like let us know.
Okay.
And most of us have been there and can clarify that one.
Okay, so it would kind of be the impression or the opinion of our members.
Right, like having these collective perspectives, like what are they experiencing from their schools, from their region, and how are they sort of approaching those similar questions. But yeah, it's a really good point of clarification. So jumping in, you should all have received the questions in advance, so we won't go through and read them, but basically Same setup, we want to maximize the time there, so we'll move into this quickly. Just reminders on equity of voice, making sure everybody's got a chance to speak and accepting non-closure and all the other norms and expectations we set out. So just wanting to ring that bell quickly. The only change that we made here was just to add on the second question about how to better leverage city resources. That the thinking there was, an example being that it is potentially about, county bus systems or safe passage to school, and less so about a broad understanding of a city resource, in its entirety. So I will leave these up. You should have also grabbed one of these on the way in. You should have a handout just for if you want to jot notes down on it, or anything else like that. Otherwise, so we have the room next door as well that is set up for small groups. If I can ask, table in the front here and table in the back over there to shift to that room, just so we can spread out a little bit more. And then, as we mentioned, we'll facilitate and sort of float around to support as we can. So yeah.
That was a good question, by the way.
Yeah, I've been wondering, because I looked at some of these notes.
Oh, and if you want to switch tables, if you want to talk to somebody you haven't talked to since the last time, like, we do want to encourage you all to branch out and connect with new folks, if you didn't already do so. So there's
populated, I mean, they're self-selecting, so people
Right.
have some knowledge of it, but.
Right. I mean, I could make, I can make assumptions, but
I'll go.
I'm not a parent.
I can only speak from my contributions in the small group, but the No, that's what we say.
Been working on it already. No, you're great.
I talked to Bobby about that.
Yep, yep.
Oh, no.
You are.
Yes,
All right.
you were the one
So,
taking notes.
just to make sure we have enough time to do a quick share out, if you
She got
wanna
volunteered.
pick somebody from your group to give a sort of a minute report out on the highlights of what the group discussions were. I wanna make sure we have time to get through them all, so does anybody feel inspired to start? Got one in the back here, awesome, thank you.
Less likely to forget anything. So for number one, how does transportation?
Sorry, y'all. Go ahead.
So for question one, you know, transportation can be the driver for families if they've got job considerations that mean, or we talked about safety considerations, which I know has come up. And reducing transportation costs could come from, you know, more equitable access to specialty programs. You don't have to travel as far to find a certain program. City resources for transportation, we talked about how students used to ride buses, but there were kind of some safety concerns around that. And so you have to mitigate that, but that's a potential partnership. In terms of guidelines for specialty programs, we talked about making sure there's equitable, you know, access that some of the disparities maybe make some logical sense, like where you've got ESL programs, where you have dual language programs might be, you know, just kind of a nature of where concentrations of families that you know need and want those supports may be, but other things like Montessori, IB shouldn't be like geographically distributed in an uneven way. And we're just talking about continuity pathways across grade levels, trying to think about ways that you can expose students to options earlier without forcing them to say at a very early age, this kid is gonna do all arts or all STEM or all, you know, language or things like that. We talked about elements of a neighborhood school, that there's gotta be a true incentive to choose the neighborhood school. And that we have to be mindful from an equity perspective that sometimes when we talk about neighborhood schools, remember that, you know, the current system was a pivot away from that in part because of the massive residential segregation that we have in the city and in this region, and that, you know, if we push too far in that direction without an equity lens, you could just bring back that situation, which is not ideal. The things that I didn't touch on that. Good. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. Anybody else want to volunteer? Okay. You want to?
They volunteered me. They said I was a note taker, so, we started on question 2 on how to leverage services. And we kind of started out with, you know, relating to students' needs, of the late arrivals, kind of trying to understand, is that a value? Is there a way to discipline? You know, how are we setting the standards up? Is it a standard and a value, or is there a way to implement discipline if it's a difference in value? So that was kind of the conversation there. Touched on the bus as a babysitter and, you know, priorities of why choices are being made. Is there ways that we can, again, change parents' mind or, you know, set a trend for thinking differently? And create a system of accountability. We talked about the city and state and county availability of land where students could gather for ride sharing or some kind of alternative ride program for busing that might be helpful. The ride share services, we touched on the piggybacking, trying to define, you know, how many schools actually use the city bus, came up with Reagan. I think there was another one, but it didn't come up in the conversation. King, having flyer buses, Sherman having had them. You brought up the mention of turf wars and bus stops. 2-hour parking was a new one that I hadn't heard yet, but the neighborhoods, limiting parking for performances and events where you might have 400 people show up and students. So parking being a detractor for students wanting to drive their own cars, who may be able to, because there's no place to park. And likewise with drop-off zones, et cetera. Yeah, I think the concept that the specialty schools drive an unfair situation, even though that's not the original intent. And that the independent nature of the way schools can choose how they bring programs up out of the ground or not, sort of, there's no defined way to balance the invention of those programs. They just arrive, depending on who wants to bring them up. So, you know, sometimes curriculum will create changes that are maybe equitable more consciously, but generally it's independent. Yeah, so anything else you guys wanted me to mention?
Awesome, thank you all. All right, 2 tables left. Any takers? Go for it.
We can go. So we talked about how even though specialty programs are a factor, it's not necessarily a main driver because you have specialty programs in, you know, some neighborhoods that may be perceived negatively that aren't being fully utilized. Like there's several Montessori programs where those schools don't have enrollment caps. And so we were saying how, you know, the reputation of the school, the thought of safety actually has a lot to do with it. So just because you put more resources into a school, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to go to that school. So we talked about a few things like how do you try and get people to go to those schools? So one, you know, policy change was perhaps caps on enrollment in the schools that are really full, because then that might drive more people to stay in their neighborhood or see what other schools are available. We talked about how maybe changing transportation so that, I think it's 2 miles, but people who don't feel safe walking to school, maybe in those neighborhoods, busing a shorter distance away from the school would actually help make it more convenient. And then offering wraparound care in those areas that we're hearing that people are sending their kids to school on the, you know, sending their kids on the bus so that they don't have to worry about transportation. We talked about the potential of those schools also that's maybe under-resourced, looking at partnerships with other schools where perhaps there's transportation to specialty programs. So maybe in some cases you're investing more in transportation and less in the school of resources, but you're still trying to give people equitable care to all of, or equitable access to after-school programs and other things like that. We did talk about partnerships with county transit. We acknowledge that could be, you know, challenging because of the way that things are set up. People don't necessarily live on their bus route, but you know, there could be some conversations had there. Is there anything I'm missing?
Great, well, thank you, and I appreciate everybody staying a little bit after, but last but not least.
So we pretty much covered all the same things to make this really short. We also talked though, just a couple of the brief things was how people do actually make very conscious choices about where they live and why they're living where they live, like based on access to school, but we can't really paint that into like a single box. Some people choose where they are buying or living because they want to walk. Other people choose to buy or rent or go where they are because they can get a bus. And so that's very different depending on where we are. So it's really hard to pin that to one specific thing. And that's, sometimes that's regional based, sometimes that's school based. We talked a little bit just about, you know, career pathway or continuity pathways and being able to make sure that those exist, trying to as best as we can. There are some that exist, sometimes they're not there, sometimes they're kind of loosely there, or they were better defined in the past, and kind of saying like, if we're gonna have programs, we need to like make sure that we actually have the programs and not just try to, going back to what we were talking about the first week, just incentivizing, schools to have students so they can get teachers and like actually having students at schools for programs. And then again, kind of like everything that everybody was talking about, just with like safety of walking, safety of, getting on a bus, MCTS also came up as a discussion, but how it's partially used now, but it's not, it has a history of why it also was gone away from, and MCTS has its own budgetary issues, so it's not like they can cut a lot of deals to another government entity that has its own budget to try and amend. So, yeah, did I miss anything? Good.
Awesome. Thank you all so much and really appreciate you sharing out. The end here is just the same bits, so we'll have the survey sent out tomorrow morning. Nothing we really groundbreaking here, but just a reminder, next month we'll be talking about facilities. Would love to get your thoughts on questions to ask. That might be helpful to get community feedback. Again, we know that we're still sort of in this really like shared understanding and knowledge component, and really looking forward to digging into buildings next time, and then really starting to think more strategically in an application sense. So yeah, happy to have you all here tonight. Happy to hang around for a couple minutes afterwards if there are questions, and we appreciate your time as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My teacher here, so I